and Tom Murray. And I did want to thank them on behalf of all of us in our community for their participation here today. These are people that have actually come from outside our community and are coming in to help educate us, help answer questions that we have. And we know this is a very difficult area. And so I did want to thank them for their willingness to come in and really help us from the outside. And this is an area that we know and we planned is going to be very frustrating for our community. I think if you look at it, it's this area where the hopes that we have, the great hopes that we have in the community, along with the people that we really care for most, come up against policies, procedures, regulations, and that's really just this recipe for frustration when you have these two things clashing. And so we know this is going to be a very frustrating area. We know that there's difficult questions. I think what we wanted to do with this webinar is keep going on an area that we've tried to kind of lead into this year, particularly with some activities at the conference, the clinical trials book we put out, really kind of making sure that everybody has the right information on this topic, and also having an open discussion. That there's definitely going to be difficult questions. We and everybody we as an organization, Cure SMA, the people on the webinar here, I think are very open to just having honest answers come back to you all. They're definitely not going to always be the answers that you want to hear, but I think that's our commitment, that we really just want to make sure that everybody has the information they need and that we're answering questions as honestly as we can. I think the other thing to kind of bear in mind is we're coming to this stage. We're talking about this stage of the final clinical trial phases and where you get into the discussion with the FDA, regulatory discussions that go on. I think this is coming from success. We're at this stage, we're getting this frustration because we've been successful with the clinical development. And I think that's a good sign for us all to bear in mind. I think as well, the good sign for us in the SMA community is that we're not talking about just one program. We're talking about all of the programs that are in development, the 18 that we've got going on now, and the 7 that are particularly in clinical trials. What we actually want to focus on in this particular webinar is talking about all of the programs in development. We're actually not going to get into detail on any specific one or talk about the particular specific issues of any one program. We're going to talk generally about all the programs that we currently have going on. And I think that's something to point out as well, that the issues that we're talking about here, the phase 3 clinical trials, the regulatory issues that come up, they apply to all of the programs that are in development. We're going to have the same issues coming up for all of the ones that we've got going on. So with that, I wanted to actually hand over to Jill just to give a little bit more of a background on our speakers and the topic here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm Jill Jarecki, the Cure SMA Research Director, and I want to echo Kenneth's thoughts in thanking the panelists for volunteering their time today and say that none of them are working actively in the SMA space, so they will not be able to answer questions on specific drug programs, but are really here to address the process and expectations overall. And our first speaker will be Dr. Tim Franson. He's the Chief Medical Officer at Your Encore, where he provides regulatory advice on preclinical, clinical, and post-marketing drug programs to a number of different groups, as well as information on how to interact with the FDA. And he's going to speak to us about late-stage clinical development, the timelines, and the things that can go on during that phase of clinical development. And next we'll have Dr. Tim Miller from Genzyme. He is the Vice President and Head of Medical Affairs, and he has worked in a number of cross-functional roles across the clinical drug development space, and he has also led the largest rare disease registry program in rare disease. And he will talk to us a bit about expanded access and timing of NDA submissions. And then finally, we'll have Tom Murray, who is the President Emeritus of the Hastings Center. He is a bioethicist, and he will talk to us about ethical considerations in drug development. And Dr. Murray, for full disclosure, has advised a drug company on the ethics of drug development that is working on SMA. So now we'd like to turn to Dr. Franson, who will give his presentation on late-stage clinical development.
Thanks very much, Jill. Welcome to all of you. Delighted to be able to spend time with you. And I have been involved in rare disease efforts, first in a long career within industry at Eli Lilly, and now subsequently in consulting. And perhaps one thing of significance is that I was on the steering committee for the Duchenne muscular dystrophy guidance, which has fundamentally changed the climate for how rare diseases may interact with FDA. So I would like to give you a brief background, understanding I'm talking, as you can see, about a 10 to 15 year process, and I have 10 minutes to share all of that with you. So let's focus on the fact that first, when you go from left to right, when you have 5 to 10,000, back aside, thank you, compounds, that they are rapidly screened out from the time you're in test tubes to the time you go into humans. And between phase 2 and phase 3, a number of you are probably aware that there have been successful phase 2 studies that don't pan out in larger phase 3 trials. As you see at the bottom of that center portion there, the number of patients or volunteers who may be involved in a trial kind of go up by a log scale as one goes from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. We'll be talking primarily about that phase 3, which is called confirmatory clinical studies, and then what the FDA expects to see from a drug sponsor in order to be able to make a decision about approval. So here's the legal framework for drug regulation. Congress sets laws, FDA on that basis then adds on top of that, not instead of that, regulations which are firm, guidelines which are less firm, and provide advice. But in culmination, all of it requires that there are very significant evidence about safety, effectiveness, and quality of any medicine, whether it's for a rare or a common disease. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the fact that there are different perspectives, if I could have, thank you, on approval and development. And I think it's important to appreciate the top and bottom boxes here. FDA looks at candidate new drugs with the perspective of, do the benefits outweigh the risks for the population? And obviously, patients and parents, as you do, think about benefits and risks in terms of personal values. So what is that burden of proof, and is the burden of proof different for FDA versus patients? It does come down to what are the benefit expectations and what are the risk tolerances. And certainly with Duchenne and other diseases, there have been a fundamental movement in that regard to help patient communities and FDA come to closer understanding. And it's our hope that will happen also through Cure SMA. So if I could have the next slide. It's important to think about how FDA approaches their mission, and indeed, they're responsible to Congress and the public to protect us from unsafe events, but also to promote public health, meaning expediting innovation, and still to follow all the rules. While the rules may have some flexibility for rare diseases, the rules are not different, and the burdens of proof for rare versus common diseases on benefit outweighing risk are pretty much the same. So rare diseases don't have a different set of standards, if you will. And from the next slide, please, atop all those layers of rules, one understands that public events such as drug crises, court decisions, other elements may influence how those deliberations by FDA are made. So there are policies and practices that apply. There are matters of how FDA is supported in its resourcing. Some come from federal appropriations from Congress. Some come from user fees, which are the fees paid by drug sponsors for applying for a new drug or a new biologic application. But one thing of significance at the bottom of this slide is the importance of change and the exciting changes we've seen for pediatric and rare disease provisions in what's called PDUFA, Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which in 2012 for the first time provided incentives for rare drug development. And that's important for Cure SMA and related rare disease groups. So to go to the next slide, how do companies really know what FDA expects in submissions? Well, we already talked a little bit about laws, regulations, and guidelines, and there are some pretty proscriptive rules that say exactly how you need to present information from trials. We'll get to how the trials get constructed in a minute. But each company who applies for a new drug application or new biologic application can talk with the FDA during that development time about their individual products and what special expectations there may be. In regard to what might be special, there are expedited programs. You may have read about them, and these are called, under the category of expedited programs, breakthrough therapy or fast track designation, and that relates to the planning phases. And then in the submission phases, accelerated approval and priority review. So let's go to the next slide and just give you a sense of what those differences are. I'll go back to that same diagram I showed you before. And as you see, the two new white arrows there, breakthrough and fast track, are granted to a company by FDA sometime during the development process, during clinical trials, and apply to both how a sponsor, a company, may interact with FDA, and also some of the provisions for the final application. In contrast, accelerated approval or priority review come at the time of the FDA review process, and they dictate how rapidly that application may go through the review process and what requirements may be involved. So let's dig a little bit deeper into those two programs that occur during planning phases, development. Fast track designation requires that something has a serious condition involved and that some preliminary data, animal or human, is available. It helps companies work more facilely with the FDA, and it must be accomplished, applied for before a submission is done. Breakthrough is kind of like fast track on steroids, if you will. It requires a serious disease, but with preliminary clinical data. So there has to be something there that says it works in man. And it provides additional help in the plans and submission process to help grease the skids for that review process. For the next slide then, please. What happens when after accelerated, or rather after the two other programs I just discussed, you can actually get both of these together. You cannot get breakthrough and fast track together. They're mutually exclusive. But you can get accelerated approval and priority review for the same application. Accelerated approval is kind of interesting. It requires a serious condition with some meaningful clinical advantage over available therapies. The difference is it uses in its clinical trials a surrogate endpoint which predicts benefit on what FDA describes as irreversible morbidity and mortality. So survival, if you will, or serious things that can occur that can't be reversed. The approval is possible with a surrogate, and that is a bit of a different standard for approval, but it then requires a number of things post-approval to confirm that the drug actually works on the ultimate endpoints of irreversible morbidity and mortality. Priority review is something that gets determined in the first 2 months that FDA has a new application, and FDA can then decide based on what they see in their first pass review whether they can reduce their review time by 4 months. That would be from 10 months to 6 months for a priority review. So let's go on to the next slide and just say that with all those programs, whether you're accelerated or not, whether you have priority or not, whether you're fast track or not, and so forth, FDA decisions are driven by the data that the sponsor provides. And they require internal reviewers and external experts to look at that information and help with the decisions. If there are no data, then no decision can be made. And so no drug can be marketed in the United States until what's termed substantial evidence has been provided. And that's about, as I mentioned before, quality, safety, and effectiveness of the candidate agent drug, and that the benefits have to outweigh the risk for the population study. So what's meant by that study? Let's go to the next slide. We talked about focusing on phase 3 and benefits outweighing risks. Those phase 3 or late phase studies provide that burden of proof to FDA. Understandably, for patient communities, what might be hoped for and expected may be less than what FDA might be required to do under their legislative remit. And most trials are generally powered with, that is, having enough patients in those trials to establish whether the drug works, but not to fully characterize risks in a broader population. So, an approval of a new drug requires that there be that balance of benefit and risk, and this is looked at not only at approval, but after approval, and this is how FDA looks at benefit and risk. The severity of the condition, if you look down the left column by the FDA logo there, the unmet clinical need, in other words, are there other drugs available for a patient population? How significant is the benefit? How major are the risks? And are the risks able to be managed or mitigated? So that's how they think about that, and they use these checked boxes to say, how does it all weigh out in their formulas? In the next slide, it's an interesting graphic that actually one of FDA's top regulators has presented at public conferences in terms of what a regulator thinks about in terms of benefit and risk. And this characterizes why they may think a bit differently than a patient or parent might about these. So some very detailed things. Are there similar products in a similar class of drugs that may have caused problems? Are there clinically relevant or irrelevant points to how they measured the outcomes of these trials? How serious are the adverse events which are looked at and so forth? I don't mean to go through all these, but to give you a sense of, it's a fairly extensive and interesting process, and they're trying to do the right thing for patients and the public overall. So the next slide would be just that review process to indicate there's kind of 3 steps. So when a drug company completes its phase 3 or final trials and submits a package of information to FDA, which is usually pretty substantial. It used to be that we'd ship them on semi-trailers with all the copies of data. Now with the wonders of electronics, they can be pressed on discs, but there's still a lot of information to review. So FDA has 2 months to look at that and decide if they've got enough to make any kind of decision. And if so, they'll say an application is fileable. And then they either get 6 months or 10 months to finish the review, depending on how they judge it to be a priority, that is, meeting an unmet medical need or not. And then the next step of 6 or 10 months begins, where a number of people at FDA are looking at these applications. Then they move to the final step, the action date and the action package, which then can be a full approval or a request for more information and more review. So if we can go to the next slide, and I'm almost done. The importance of patient voice is key, but the importance of patient data from independent registries, such as some rare disease communities have assembled, are really important. Disease-specific benefit and benefit risk information, advocacy at public meetings such as advisory committee and so forth are key. And perhaps later we can talk about what the Duchenne community did in terms of independently developing guidance to help FDA understand the process. For the final slide I have, it's just to remind us that rare diseases, while they have benefits provided to the sponsors and a bit different rules, smaller trials may be possible, but the rules and the burdens of proof are the same for rare and common diseases. So with that, I would like to stop here. I'll be happy to entertain questions later, and I'll turn it over to my other colleague, the second Dr. Tim.
This is Jill Jarecki again, and I'm going to quickly turn it over to Megan to let everyone know how to submit questions that we'll take at the end.
Great, thanks, Jill. We've already received several great questions. I know we had a couple people join us a little bit late, so I just wanted to reiterate, you have kind of a little control panel on the right side, and there is a tab in there that's called questions. Just type your question in there, hit enter. It will come to us, and then we'll go through as many of these as we can once we hit the question and answer time.
So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Timothy Miller, who is the Vice President and Head of Medical Affairs at Genzyme, and he is going to follow up on what Dr. Franson had talked about the typical ways that late-stage drug development occurs, to talk about some mechanisms for which you can have further access to drugs during the clinical trial period. And so now I'll hand it over to Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Jill. I hope that everyone can hear me. It's a real privilege to be here and to work with you and Ken and the group to put this together. I see there are several hundred patients and families and who knows who else might have joined this conference, but I am thrilled to see this type of interest from this community. As you know, Jill, I know this community. I've served as a head of an MDA clinic for many, many years. I've taken care of quite a few patients with SMA and dealt with many families as they've gone through this very difficult time with their family members. And many years ago, I took the chance to make a move over and start working within this drug development community because of my interest in trying to bring therapies. I do want to tell everyone that, as I said, I'm a neuromuscular neurologist. I trained alongside Alan Pestronk and Ann Connolly in St. Louis at the large neuromuscular clinic there, and I spent some time with Valerie Swick, many of you might know, before she went to work for the MDA. I have no personal financial relationships. I do work for Genzyme, a company that works almost exclusively in rare diseases for my part, and I own stock in them, but I don't have any, but there's no ongoing clinical trials for any agents in people with spinal muscular atrophy. I hope I can give you a little bit more about some of the programs that are offered, maybe give you a little better view as to the potential risks and the potential benefits, and then understand some of the challenges that developers face, because as you'll see, while many of these programs could be delivering experimental drugs to patients, there aren't a lot active. Why don't you go to the next slide? I'm going to try to move through this a little fast so that I don't bog down the time. Many of you might know Josh Hardy, who's in this picture from last summer. He had a rare form of cancer and had used drugs that were available for that. There was some data that a new drug in development that was not approved might have a benefit for the type of viral infection that he was having. It was not being investigated for that. It was being investigated for something else. There was a real media firestorm around Josh's case, and so many very supportive people checked in and made their voices heard, and eventually this young man did get the experimental therapy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to bring it up. We're in an age where people in general, families, family friends, legislators, and others have such an important and loud voice sometimes. Go to the next slide. I wanted to say that I think that that expanded access to investigational drugs really comes from the fact that our drug development takes a lot of time, and I want to say that our drug development is a shared responsibility between a number of different people. That of course includes patients, families, companies, regulators like the FDA, and a number of other folks. These programs are often called expanded access. Drug companies sometimes like to call a pre-approval access to make certain that everyone understands the drug that they're talking about is not approved. And of course, patients and other groups, very appropriately so, want to call it compassionate use. I think it's important because everyone benefits when a drug is brought to market to patients faster if that drug is safe and effective. And so that's where we have to shorten the time. Investigational drug use in clinical trials, the intent is research. We're trying to find out if the drug is safe, if it's effective, if it does what we think it does, if it harms patients in a different way, and we don't know it. That's why the drug's investigational. The FDA has tried to shorten their timelines with the programs that Dr. Franson mentioned earlier, and I think we are seeing some movement there. Investigational drug use outside of clinical trials, the intent is treatment, as you can see. Now, sometimes we don't have any comparable data to know. We don't understand what all the side effects or problems may be, but the intent is treatment. You can go to the next slide. How many expanded access programs are operating in the U.S. right now? Well, there's greater than 45,000 active trials right now in clinicaltrials.gov. Only 483 are called expanded access, and only about 198 of those are active at the moment. So it's important to know that these are not offered as many times as they might be able to, and there's some reasons why, and I want to go through those so you understand. There's limited data on how many people asked for them, what type of request they asked for, where it came from, a patient or a physician, how much patients are desiring these programs and asking people, but they're not getting them. Companies out there are asked all the time to do this, and they choose not to for a number of reasons. We need to understand this data, but we do know that there are only a fraction of the expanded access programs that people are interested in. Next slide. I always like to characterize the word potential benefits and potential risks when it comes to this. I think we can go on through this slide and just say that we don't know what the benefits and risks are. We have an idea, but certainly not enough to the point that the FDA would feel comfortable allowing these drugs to be given to patients, certainly not to be marketed. I will give you an example of a case with a drug that was not yet approved, that the FDA was okay, and a company that I worked for previously and I am with now, Genzyme, had a very large expanded access program for a drug called Myozyme before it was approved. You can go to the next slide. The FDA's perspective is that they approve almost all of these requests. If you ask them now, they will show you data that shows they approve 99% of these type of expanded access programs. So whether those are individual patients and physicians requesting access, or intermediate-sized group, or very large groups that are asking for these, they approve almost all requests. They've actually made the paperwork easier early this year because it was fairly complicated. I received the ability to use an unapproved drug for 2 patients with a condition that I saw in clinic, and it was very, very time-consuming to put that through, weeks and weeks. The new Form 3926 that I mentioned here should make it easier for doctors to fill out and try to get individual patient access. It should make it easier for the FDA's portion of it. I also wanted to mention, as many of you know, there are now right-to-try laws that are popping up in many states. I don't know what the total number is now. It might be 18 now. I don't think that's fully within the scope of this, but some of the issues with the right-to-try laws being able to bring more access to patients are the same issues that I'm going to talk about now. I put in red at the bottom, the ultimate access to any therapy that patients can use is FDA approval, because that opens doors so that therapies can be reimbursed for patients who have insurance but don't have money to pay for it outside of insurance. It brings a lot of other programs online. So if we want to serve patients the best way, we want to get drugs approved. We understand that because of the slowness in the process, there is a lot of pressure. You can go to the next slide. Also, I wanted to remind you that just because a patient and a doctor want to request access doesn't mean they just get it and then they get the drug and then they take it. This has to be looked at by what's called an institutional review board. That's wherever the physician is working. They would have to review it. They have to decide if they agree that there's enough safety precautions. Many of these IRBs, as we call them, are not really familiar with programs where the intent is treatment. They're more focused to research. They can be pretty conservative, and they do have some liability concerns that they might be at risk if someone is hurt. And they often charge $2,000 to $3,000 to review, and in these processes sometimes there's no federal money or no industry money set aside to pay for those types of things, and that's been a roadblock that's been discussed. Go on to the next slide. As I said, I think it's a community, doctors, drug manufacturers, IRBs, FDA, and patients. It's a real community responsibility. Next slide. Why don't you just go to the next slide? I was noting this Cancer Action Now. The groups around cancer have done a fabulous job of pushing expanded access programs, i.e. access to investigational drugs as early as possible. As I said, the approval process has lengthened quite a bit. It has been confusing. It's better now. The expedited pathways that Dr. Franson talked about do shorten time to delivery. Everyone benefits when a safe and effective therapy is approved faster. Everyone benefits. Companies benefit, patients benefit, families benefit. Frankly, insurers benefit because they are focused to getting optimal health in those patients. So there's a huge need still. And go on to the next slide. This is a snapshot out of the 202,000 studies that are ongoing right now in the world. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Only a small number, 328. Actually, this was on the 6th. When I searched it yesterday just to update my numbers, it was a little bit higher. About 198 of those expanded access programs now are active. Next slide, please. And as you can see, most of the expanded access programs are in North America, if you look at the numbers and how they're spread across the globe. Next slide. So while we enjoy the highest access, most likely, to expanded access programs, we know that it certainly does not feel like it's enough. And this was what I hearkened to earlier. We know there's an incredible need for new therapies that are better, or for the first therapy for many of the rare diseases that we study, that we want to. And we've never been in a time where the visibility of an individual person is more increased. We can make it immediate with the use of social media, internet, Facebook, Twitter, all these things. And it can create significant celebrity very quickly. Next slide. As a doctor, and I still consider myself that, my first business every day is caring for patients. While I don't do that in the clinic now, my entire team at Genzyme working on rare diseases, we see our job as one thing, and that's to help physicians and payers make evidence-based decisions that will improve outcomes for patients. And in rare disease, that can be very difficult to do. Obviously, I talked about this being a difficult process. It's been improved a bit. There are still some difficulties for physicians to do it, and it is sometimes difficult to find physicians who are willing to do it. And there are financial costs that can be incurred. Next slide. Why don't we go to the next slide? So one more slide. This is the Tufts Center for Drug Development. They're trying to make a difference here, and what they're saying is that new drug development processes can make a big difference in how fast drugs can get approved. Next slide. This is what I think is one of the most important pieces of information for you, because you are interacting with a number of research programs. I think Jill said 18, 7 that are in clinical trials right now. Many of the biotech companies that are developing these are small. Many of them are very small, less than 100, less than 50 employees. manufacturers have to agree to make the product and to participate in expanded access. Even though the FDA approves all of them, the company has to agree to do it. They have to make the product, which sometimes they don't have the capacity to do, and sometimes they don't have the money to do. I've seen very small companies that don't have enough money to move to produce anything more than they need to produce for the clinical trial. And if you don't produce enough to run your clinical trial, then you risk never getting approved and never having the ability to affect patients in a positive way. There's a little bit of paperwork. It can be very large, though, depending on what happens. And you do have to collect data on the effects of this, and I think these are the main reasons that sometimes people push back. The reason I put regulatory process on the bottom, go to the next slide, is that there have been companies like this company whose study was put on hold, and many people were frustrated with that because of an expanded access program patient that had a side effect. It did not affect the timelines for development, and it was lifted within 2 months. But this is something that I think companies are increasingly frightened about. Next slide. I was going to mention a very large expanded access program that was put together at Genzyme for patients with late onset Pompe disease. Hundreds of patients joined this, and it lasted for several years. I think we'll skip that story because I don't want to take too much time. The next slide. Really, that's what I think the most important thing is, that we as company members, as physicians, and as caregivers have to make certain that we do protect patients. We understand that the risk-benefit assessment is a little different when dealing with rare diseases where no cure or no therapy even exists, but we have to be partners as physicians and industry to patients and patient advocates, and we understand that companies and industry, of which I'm a part now, and again, these are my views, should be a partner in figuring out the best pathways forward, in finding a balance that can bring patients therapies that are safe and effective earlier. And I think that's all that I have.
Thank you, Tim. And so now we're going to turn to Dr. Tom Murray, who will talk a little bit about some of the ethical considerations for the different things that Dr. Miller has just talked about.
Thanks very much, Jill. Thanks to the other speakers, and thanks in particular to the families and to people with SMA who are participating in this call. So I'm Tom Murray. I was president of the Hastings Center, which was well, it's sort of the leading bioethics institute, or the founding bioethics institute in the world. So we worry about issues in ethics and medical ethics and ethics in science. I'm no longer working there. I'm now president emeritus, and since I left the center, some companies have come asking me for ethical advice about a variety of issues, and so including at least one company that has some interest in creating a therapy that would address SMA. I'm going to take a step back and ask about the broader issues, the sort of the moral justification and foundation for how we do drug development and why we do it, and where expanded access programs sit in. So the next, would you take us to the next point, please, on the slide? Right. For clinicians, for the people leading the scientific studies, and for the responsible companies trying to develop new therapies, the primary ethical obligation is really to find ways to help children and families. Next. So you want to find new therapies, and you want to show conclusively, you want to develop sufficient evidence to be able to say confidently whether on balance this drug provides important benefits to patients. Next. There's no question, and it's interesting that the other two speakers have made the same point. The fastest way to help the most children with SMA is to complete the clinical trials the FDA is going to require to make its determination that the therapy in fact works, and that it should be made broadly available. Next. So we've heard some intelligence about expanded access. You can get this prior to approval of an investigational therapy. You can get it for an individual. You can get it for an intermediate size group or for a large group for widespread use. The specific requirements differ for those options, but for all of them, FDA demands that, number one, patients can't get the therapy through a clinical trial. So if you would qualify for a clinical trial, you are not eligible for expanded access. And they also, and this is a very important criterion, that providing the drug through expanded access will not interfere with clinical trials, with their initiation, with their conduct, or with their completion. So the FDA's emphasis is clearly getting the data needed as quickly as possible to see whether or not it really helps. Next. Now, there's some practical complications. Previous speakers have noted these. One is, in some cases, the supply of the therapy may be inadequate to really have any kind of large expanded access program. If it's a small molecule, something you can stick in a pill, that's one thing. But if it's a complex biological or a gene therapy construct, it could be quite another thing. And that will just vary from program to program. You must also have physician investigators who are available, willing, and able to satisfy FDA requirements because they have to supervise the expanded access program. And lastly, as was mentioned, the IRB, their human subjects protection panels, they must approve, and that takes time and money. And there's some ethical complexities. Now, from the point of view of an investigator and a company developing a drug, until you're confident that whatever you're making is actually making the children better off, you run the risk of making them worse off. Something that scientists say over and over again is that the plural of anecdote is not data. Simply that means that the fact that I have one or two or a handful of dramatic cases that look like my investigational therapy is working is not proof that it is working. These things can happen. You can get this kind of a set of anecdotes for all sorts of reasons. I was involved with a company that had a therapy that looked terrific in phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. And during the phase 3 trials, I worked with them to come up with a very ambitious expanded access program that would treat thousands of persons suffering with this really awful disease. And the phase 3, when the phase 3 data came in, it was completely ineffective. So you don't want to jump the gun here until you really have proof. So case studies, unfortunately, are not scientific proof. They're not that way to the scientists, and the FDA doesn't take them as that. So a caution that I've discovered that in practice, if you have premature expanded access, you actually run a greater likelihood of either slowing down or derailing the approval of even an effective therapy rather than accelerating it. So bear that in mind. Next, please. There was one line there. You don't have to go back. I'm just going to mention it. If you think about expanded access, it's very important that you pay attention to equity and fairness. There's a sad history of particularly individual compassionate use cases where it's the people who have the strongest political connections or the deepest pockets who get it, and people who are just not in those circumstances don't get it. So you want to pay attention to equity and fairness. Thanks. Next slide. So you need conclusive evidence that on balance it helps. It helps significantly the patients. You want to be sure that expanding access won't delay or undermine FDA approval. You want to help the most patients in the shortest possible time. And if you're going to do expanded access, you must make sure that patients and families understand the risks, the benefits, and the uncertainties that attend these programs. And you have to design and execute an expanded access program that will be fair and equitable to all persons, all patients. Okay, now I have a couple of sort of finishing points. I don't need a slide for them. I think if I were in your position, I'd want to know what can I do. A few things you can do. You can ask companies what they're doing to accelerate development and accelerate approval. You can also ask companies what they're doing to make advanced preparations for expanded access programs. You can ask them what are your intentions with respect to expanded access programs, if and when there is sufficient proof that it's effective, but before it's approved by the regulatory authority like FDA. And what are you doing to be as prepared as possible to move as quickly as possible with expanded access if and when we get to that level of approval? Thanks very much.
Great, thank you everyone. And thank you to all our attendees for sending in all your great questions. We're going to go ahead and turn it back over to our panelists to answer as many of these questions as possible. I want to let you know that all the questions you've sent in have been captured, so even if we aren't able to get to your question right now, we're going to go ahead and collect them all and look to answer them on our website, through email, through different channels like that. And again, please do send us questions through info@curesma.org if you have a question that you weren't able to submit or something that occurred to you after this webinar. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Tim Franson, our first presenter. He's going to go ahead and take a question, and then we'll kind of go through in rotation.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And I believe the first question that I see here is, would a company with a drug that has fast-track status or breakthrough continuously be giving data to FDA? And if so, would the FDA approve the drug as soon as it felt it had enough data to prove safety or efficacy instead of waiting for a formal submission? Two answers to that. First, that the company is providing continual information on safety to the FDA. And that would be any company. There are certain reporting requirements for trials and even after a drug's approved. But to the second part of that question, would FDA approve something just on kind of a rolling status without having a formal submission? The answer is no. There needs to be a complete and comprehensive package of information to allow them to make final determinations. Parts can go in advance, and some of the reviewers may actually be able to work on that in advance, but it's not only the safety and efficacy, it's also the manufacturing and quality issues, so all the pieces have to be there. Now that said, FDA has on occasion made very rapid decisions in less than the proscribed amount of review time they've had. So even with the priority review, and approval within several months, if the information is convincing, is possible. And I'll stop there.
Jill, this is Tim Miller. I fully agree with Dr. Franson. One thing I would add is that many of the new drugs that we are all interested in seeing get approved at some point are drugs that do have very complex manufacturing and quality requirements. And so I think that companies are doing their best to work with the FDA to understand the expectations and move through those processes as quickly as possible. But these are very new technologies, and they require a lot of review to make certain that we are doing things safely.
And that trial,
great, thank you both.
And that material is available to patients once it's been approved, so that won't be interrupted. That would be tragic.
Excellent, thank you both. Tim Miller, we'll turn it over to you for the next question and answer.
So the first question that I saw for me was if the FDA approves a therapy, is it then approved at the EMA? And the EMA is the agency that approves drugs for Europe. The FDA is the agency that approves drug for us. Many other countries, we will talk about them as the FDA of China or the FDA of Japan, and we will go around that. No, each of those agencies requires their own approval. I can tell you that the regulatory folks that we work with in the companies I've worked for and that we've worked with at the FDA and the EMA, we all have a general sense of what is needed, but there are small differences. So just because a drug is approved in one country does not mean it will be approved in another. I don't know, Jill, if there was another one that said, how often does financial return play an active role in the FDA's decision to approve a drug program? I would say never. To my mind, it is based really on the protection of patients, but others may have a thought there also.
Yeah, Jim Franson here, and I agree. Never's the right answer.
Yeah, part of the FDA approval is determining what the label of the drug will say, and the label of the drug is kind of how the drug is to be used. And as many of you know, a drug that has a label that is then accepted by payers and insurance companies would call the use of that drug on label because it's being used in a way that the FDA and the company discussed when they were getting the drug approved. So it's important that that label is created with as much solid data as is possible, so that these new products can be used in the most safe way.
Great, thank you both. Tom Murray, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you for the next question.
Thanks, Jill. I see two questions for me, and they're related. So let me read the first one. It's brief. If a drug is in phase 3 and has proven effective and no known risk, why is there still placebo when it could be saving lives? And the second is, you feel that there are ethical issues in expanded access, but you don't feel that there are ethical issues in continuing the trials when it's abundantly clear what happens without the drug and what happens with. Well, this is the problem. We have phase 3 trials because phase 2 trials, uncontrolled, particularly uncontrolled, non-placebo controlled trials, don't always give you a clear answer. You can have data that looks good. You can have, as I said, anecdotes, stories that look wonderful and dramatic. And then when you actually finish and when you do the carefully placebo-controlled clinical trial, you may find out surprising things about it. You may find out it's completely ineffective or even harmful, or you may get the confirmation of the good news that we're all hoping for in all of the therapies that are advancing for SMA. But people are going to just add the regulatory authorities are going to demand a level of proof of efficacy that is pretty rare to come out of just phase 1 and phase 2. Not absolutely unknown, and I'm sure that FDA and the companies are looking at phase 2 data when it appears very promising. But that's not the same thing as clear, conclusive scientific proof.
Yeah, this is Tim Miller. I would just echo that exactly. The reason we have an FDA and a strong FDA, if you look at the history of it, is because patients have been harmed. Patients have died due to inappropriate substances being marketed to them in the remote past. It's the reason that the FDA was created. They have a very strong mandate. I think the way that we all work within that mandate to bring effective and safe drugs to patients as quickly as possible, and frankly quicker than we have been in the past, is the best path forward for all patients.
But I understand how heartbreaking and galling it is when you feel like there's something out there that might help your child. It would just be appalling if I were, I have some personal history that gives me some empathy for the parents in this situation. But at the same time, I don't, none of, on all of us should want to get the most, we want to get the conclusive proof, we want to get it to all the patients who will benefit from it as quickly as possible. And everything we can do to move quickly through the development process and the approval process is the ultimate way to do that.
I think that's an interesting challenge. How do you avoid the notion of false hope by making premature conclusions? And that's happened in multiple rare diseases, unfortunately. So how do we make sure there's adequate evidence of effectiveness? And sometimes that's very difficult, and the effect, if you will, may not be compelling. So in the rare instances where that has been compelling, like in pediatric seizure disorders, the decisions have been made rapidly.
Earlier in my life in bioethics, I advocated with FDA that they be much more open to and much more attentive to the voices of patients and families. And I think there's been a good reception to that, and I'm pleased to see that. So I would encourage people on this call to, to speak up, to speak to FDA, to speak to the companies in development, to encourage them to do everything possible to get the definitive data that will let us know which of these therapies is actually helping children and to get them approved for marketing as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you all so much. We are just about out of time. I want to reiterate all your questions that you've submitted have been captured, so if we do not get to your question now, we're going to be looking at posting some of those questions and answers on our website. This slide that you're seeing now highlights some of the additional resources that are available. I realize this is quite a bit of information. We're going to be sending you a follow-up email after this webinar that will include links to all of it, so it's not something that you need to copy down right now, but we did just want to briefly highlight kind of the breadth of resources that we have available. Earlier this year at our annual SMA conference, we put out a new booklet called Learning About Clinical Trials, which covers a lot of the topics that have been discussed here, as well as some of the more basic information on how trials are constructed, what does inclusion and exclusion criteria mean, all of that. And then several resources on what are we doing with the FDA, how are we taking advantage of the opportunities that we have to communicate the patient perspective, to communicate what's important to us, the risks, the benefits, all of that. So again, all of this will be emailed to you after this presentation, but I just wanted to go ahead and highlight it. With that, we will go ahead and say thank you to all of you for your time, especially thank you to our presenters for sharing their expertise with us. And if you have any questions, again, info@curesma.org, please feel free to send them our way. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. All the best to you. We're cheering for all the patients and parents in this.
Amen to that.
Thank you for the great work of Cure SMA.
Indeed.